Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much to Sonia Mather and Larry Gifford. That was wonderful. So our next speaker is Karen Van Ooteghem. So Karen is a scientist with the Ontario Neurodegenerative Disease Research Initiative, some of us will know as ONDRI, and holds a research appointment in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Waterloo. Karen completed her doctorate in kinesiology, behavioral and cognitive neuroscience at the University of Waterloo and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute. She works to apply her expertise in the area of balance and mobility assessment to the department and advancement of health technologies targeting healthy older adults and individuals with neurodegenerative disease. Currently, she leads operations for a platform of research within ONDRI aimed at translating clinical biomarkers into feasible, scalable, technology-based assessments that can be performed outside the clinic, in individuals' homes, and in the community. It's exciting to hear what's happening in your field research relating to Parkinson's disease, and I know we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction and to everyone for joining me today. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge, as it was in my introduction, the Ontario Brain Institute that supports a lot of the work you're going to see today through our involvement with the Ontario Neurodegenerative Disease Research Initiative. Here we go, sorry. So in 2014, Parkinsons UK commissioned a study to identify the top research priorities for people living with Parkinson's disease. The study included 1,000 participants, and they represented people living with Parkinson's disease, caregivers, family and friends, and healthcare and social professionals. The study consisted of 3 phases, or 3 stages. In the first stage, participants were simply asked to identify what they thought were important areas of research to consider. In part 2, a subgroup of those worked to prioritize those responses. And this exercise of narrowing and prioritizing continued into a third round where 27 individuals came to a consensus on the top 10 research priorities. So while the overarching research target was identified to be an effective cure for Parkinson's disease, the top 10 research priorities for Parkinson's disease management included some of what you see here on the screen. So issues related to motor symptoms, to non-motor symptoms, issues related to mental health, things like stress and anxiety, side effects of medications, specifically dyskinesia, interventions that are specific to PD phenotypes or different characterizations or classifications of behavioral features, and better monitoring methods. And I draw your attention to this paper because I believe that wearable biosensor technology, and specifically the technology that we've been working to implement in these groups, can provide viable and important contributions to address these priorities. So what is a wearable? Well, this is what it is not. So we do not strive to equip individuals with so much technology that they are no longer afforded the ability to move. Instead, wearables are most often these small, lightweight, body-worn devices that have sensor technology embedded inside of them. And this technology can monitor different physiological or behavioral features of the people who are wearing them. So although the package, so the sort of form factor of that sensor technology can vary greatly, anything from a watch to sensor technology woven into the fabric of your clothing, there is a lot of overlap of the sensor technology that is being used in these devices. And so these sensors can capture signals that we can translate to derive outcomes such as what you see here on the right-hand side. So things like heart rate or blood oxygen, respiration or breathing rate, stress, and so on. One of the sensor types that we commonly use is called an inertial measurement unit, and it's used to measure movement. So you can see here at the bottom of the screen that these sensors can be really small. The one that I've got on the screen is the size of a quarter. And it works by measuring both linear motion and angular or rotational motion. So the accelerometer, the sensor that measures linear motion, can detect 3 different planes or phases of motion. So if you imagine that you're standing and you're wearing one on your trunk, this accelerometer or this sensor would be able to detect or tell us if you were moving forward, if you were turning side to side, or if you were bending from side to side. And then that signal could be transformed into measures that classify, for example, the type of activity you're doing or the intensity of the activity, or even used to examine very specific clinically relevant features, something like tremor, for example. So the location of this sensor on the body has important consequences for the movement that you're trying to capture. And if you look at this figure that I've included on the right-hand side, which shows volume of activity, so it reads their counts, but really just think about it as the volume of activity that's being captured. This is for a person who's walking at increasing speeds on the treadmill. So you can see the volume of activity on the left-hand side is quite low, and then it gets progressively greater with increases in the speed of the treadmill. And what you can see is that the data from the ankle sensor, which is shown in the blue, shows very distinct increases in activity for every increase in speed of the treadmill. While the hip and the wrist sensors, those lines that you see in black and red, are less distinct in being able to differentiate across those different speeds. And this is particularly important if you think about measuring activity from the wrist in someone, for example, who uses a walking aid. And so if they're using the walking aid, this limits the swinging motion of the arm. And we actually also see this in individuals who have very slow or shuffling gait. And in these situations, walking is actually likely to be underestimated if we try to capture it from the wrist. So I just wanted to show an example here of those 3 planes of motion. And I have a video. This is the motion of this watch that you see in the top right-hand corner. And so what you'll see is that as the watch is being turned in different directions, these 3 lines are appearing on the screen, each representing a different plane of motion. And very shortly, you'll see as the watch is shaken, that depending what direction it's being shaken, one of those signals is quite a bit larger than all of the others. So this gives us information about the direction of movement that's occurring. And just to make this a bit more relatable, in this example, we've got someone wearing sensors, these same accelerometers, on both wrists and both ankles. The left sensors are in blue, the right sensors are in red, the wrists are at the top, the ankles are at the bottom, and this person is going to go for a walk. And so what you can see while they're walking is that the wrists look different than the ankles, so the signal that we're capturing. But in both cases, we see this reciprocal activity of left and right. It's very rhythmic. And that rhythmicity, again, allows us to draw out information about walking, mobility, the quality of the walking, so we can determine if it's highly variable. So is there issues with pace or with rhythm of the walking behavior? So now the great debate. There are so many devices out there. There's been an absolute explosion of devices, and we're often asked which is the best device to use. Unfortunately, that's not an easy question to answer because it depends really on what you intend to use it for. So these consumer-ready devices, as I like to call them, something like the Fitbit or the Apple Watch that you see here on the screen, they provide the benefit of being really convenient to use. They're watches that you wear on your wrist. And what they are designed to do is provide you with summary data. So they can tell you how many steps you took in the day, how many hours of sleep that you had. And really, they're intended to track what you did and not your health status per se. So when we talk about what's happening in these devices that we see here on the left-hand side, there are calculations that are being applied to that data that I showed you, that raw data, and then those calculations translate that data into something like average heart rate or number of steps. And in these consumer products, that's a bit of a black box. So the manufacturers won't and don't tell you how they come to those outcomes. And this can be problematic. It's actually a barrier when it comes to wanting to use these devices for clinical application, for example. So when we aim to monitor health differently, so if we want to use a wearable for clinical purposes, we need different things from our devices. We need, for example, there to be minimal requirements on the part of the user. So we don't really want them to have to engage with the device very much because we want them to just continue doing what they would normally do. We need either access to those calculations so that we can make sure that they suit our people of interest and our tasks of interest. And since that's often not possible, then we need access to these raw data. And when I say raw data, I mean the data that's stored just as it's collected, no calculations applied to it, so that we can develop new measures specific to our questions of interest. So these devices that you see on the right-hand side of the screen are examples of what I would refer to as research-ready devices. They check all those boxes that we need to advance our work. They're generic in the sense that they capture this high quality raw data that we need from some of those very common sensor technologies that I alluded to earlier. And because we have access to the raw data, we can use them in again, many different settings or situations with many different patient populations. But in addition to that, because we can synchronize these devices so we can align those signals in time across many devices, this means we can use them on multiple different body segments, and that can help to improve the accuracy of what it is that we're monitoring and also provide a more complete picture of health or disease. So don't get me wrong, if I go back to this fella for a moment, this is not our target. So when I say multiple devices, we're not striving to achieve this, but there are certainly instances when multiple sensors provide a distinct advantage over a single sensor, particularly when we're talking about complex health conditions, so something like Parkinson's disease. And this need for highly accurate data that can then inform healthcare decision-making or self-management of symptoms or disease. We do, however, need to get it right. We need to find this balance between limiting the burden on the people who are wearing the devices and optimizing clinical utility. So let me just discuss briefly an example with you. This here is reporting on a study of unsupervised home monitoring of Parkinson's disease motor symptoms, specifically in this study, dyskinesia and on-off states. So in this study, they combined accelerometers with a machine learning approach, so a special sort of advanced analytical approach to develop a detection system in daily life, so outside of the clinic. So the participants in this study were asked to wear a device on each wrist for 7 days, and they evaluated this model that they developed against diaries that the participants were asked to complete during the course of the study. So after the data were collected, they were fed into this machine learning model, and the results showed that there was high specificity for detecting dyskinesia. So that means this model was really good at telling when people weren't experiencing dyskinesia, but it had low sensitivity. So it wasn't great at being able to detect when somebody was experiencing dyskinesia. Similarly, this ability to detect on and off states was not optimal. although the overall amount of time that participants spent in either the on state or the off state correlated quite well with their self-report of when they felt they were in their on or off state. So the authors of this study concluded that the performance of their model may have suffered because they only had 2 devices. So they didn't have this volume of data that they needed to describe the movement of the participants. They also supposed that the low sensitivity to detect dyskinesia may have been because people were experiencing their dyskinesia in a body segment that didn't have a sensor, so in the leg, for example. So this is an example where there's tremendous promise for the approach, but there's a need to be able to determine how many sensors and where to put them in order to maximize the opportunity. The other reason multiple sensors can be advantageous is that they can provide complementary information that we need to interpret behavior. So I will walk you through this figure because it can, I think, appear a bit overwhelming. But what you see here is sort of 4 rows of signal data. The bottom row is day 1 and 2, 3, and 4 as you move upward for one person who's wearing this device that you see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, a wrist-worn sensor. And this is a period of time from midnight to midnight with noon down the middle with that blue line. And the signal is showing us activity. So as expected from midnight to 6, that signal isn't showing a lot of movement, but in the middle of the day, there is more. So we can start to understand how people sort of their patterns of activity throughout the course of the day. And still using that same wrist sensor, we can also analyze the data differently and get some outputs related to sleep. So now I've layered on top of here this red and orange signal where when the signal is high, it means that the person is sleeping. And when the signal is low, it means that they're either having disrupted sleep or they're awake. And so we can start to understand the pattern of sleep layered on top of the pattern of activity. And then to go even further, we can now add the second sensor. It's another accelerometer mounted to the ankle, and it's denoted here in white. So again, when the signal is high, somebody is walking. When the signal is low, they're not walking. And it's at this point that we can start to see, for example, the green signal dissociating or separating itself from the white signal. This could be instances where someone was doing something with their upper body and not walking, but it could also be instances where they were walking, but it wasn't well captured by the wrist sensor. So this, again, is just an example of how multiple sensors can help to enrich our picture of health and disease. It also affords us new ways to think about the data. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, except to say that now what you're seeing are 2 of these same types of data, but for 2 different people living with Parkinson's disease. In the bottom right, you can see a profile of a person who does a lot of walking, but not as much upper limb activity. So we're not seeing a lot of green signal. And the walking that they do is not actually being well captured by the signal that we're deriving off of the wrist-worn sensor. In the figure on the top left, we've got a very different pattern of behavior for this particular participant, where you can see that during the nighttime period, there is a lot of walking that's happening. So we're seeing a lot of white and a lot of green in a time where one might expect the person to be sleeping. So again, this is the value of layering these data, which we're capturing from different sensors. So there is, I think, this view that people won't want to wear more than one device in their daily life. But I would say that evidence from our own work and the work of others actually does not wholly support this. So we recently conducted a study through Andre called Remote Monitoring in Neurodegenerative Disease. And it was a feasibility study. So we wanted to understand how acceptable this multi-sensor wear would be in people living with neurodegenerative disease. And there was a ton of data that was collected, but wearables was part of this study. And there were 39 participants representing 5 different diseases, and 11 of those participants were people living with Parkinson's disease. To understand acceptability to our approach, we actually took a look at the amount of time during the study when the participants were not wearing the devices. And this is a behavior that appears very distinctly in the sensor data because typically the sensor is not moving when it's not being worn. And actually there's a temperature sensor embedded in this technology as well that we can use to sort of cross-examine these quiet periods and make sure that in fact it's an instance of someone not wearing the sensor. And so you can see with the orange spikes, this would be when they are wearing the sensor, and these really quiet periods denoted in the pink shading would be when they weren't wearing the sensor. And now if you look at this figure here on the left-hand side, this represents all of the participants in this study, and it's showing the proportion of time during the 7 days of data collection where they were asked to wear these sensors 24 hours a day, how much of that study period they weren't wearing the sensor. And in this figure, the gold bars represent the participants living with Parkinson's disease. So you can see that there's no pattern of non-wear or device removal that is sort of specific to disease cohort. And generally, the amount of time that people aren't wearing their devices, and in this study, we had them wearing a total of 5 devices. We specifically intended to oversample. And still with that sort of burdensome protocol, people were taking the devices off for less than 5% of the study period for the most part. We had a few people here who kind of crept up to 10, 15, 20, and 30%, but a majority of the participants really did adhere to our request to wear these multiple sensors continuously. On the right-hand side, this just shows this non-wear behavior over the course of many days. And again, you can see that there really aren't long extended periods of non-wear. It's likely shorter periods that may be attributed, in fact, to people having to take the devices off to shower or bathe, which was required for these sensors. So across all of our studies, actually, we have found that this multi-sensor approach is quite acceptable to older adults and also individuals living with neurodegenerative disease. So we're seeing the amount of time that people are wearing the device to be greater than 80% across all of the studies. So I'd like to shift gears now to talk more specifically about the potential for application of wearable technology to the management of Parkinson's disease symptoms in daily life. So I provided this earlier example of the use of wearables for the detection of dyskinesia and on and off states. But I'll provide a couple of additional examples here that relate to some of the work that we're doing within Andre, and specifically within Andre at Home. And so I'll just begin. Sort of Andre and Andre at Home were described in the introduction, but really our vision is to integrate technology-based assessments into healthcare. So we want to be able to capture information that might be useful to individuals, to care partners, to clinicians outside of the clinic, and then have this information be used supplementary to clinical care in order to achieve things like increasing health and disease tracking, early detection, treatment effectiveness, and also decreasing the burden of clinic visits if we can reduce the number of times that people have to go into clinic, and of course reducing the need for self-report, which can be a common requirement when we're talking about behaviors like sleep, for example. So why at home? We spend a lot of time within Andre at Home focusing on these lifestyle behaviors, things like sleep or mobility or social engagement, because there's good evidence of the links between health status and these types of measures that we can capture at home. So the examples that I've got listed here related to Parkinson's disease demonstrate the value of understanding sleep and gait, for example, with alterations in these behaviors being some of the earliest symptoms that patients report experiencing, as well as the value of understanding physical activity given its link to therapeutic benefit. To emphasize the importance of examining lifestyle behaviors in addition to these clinical features of the disease, I just want to go back to the REMIND study data for a moment. So here you see the data again for all 39 participants, and each person is reflected as a row of data. And the data is showing an average over the course of the 7 days of the amount of time that participant spent sleeping, which is denoted in blue, sedentary, which is denoted in gray, engaged in light physical activity, which is denoted in yellow or gold, and moderate to vigorous activity, which is denoted in green. And you can see the little legend at the top, and the length of those bars, the blue sleep bar, for example, is the recommendations for the amount of sleep we should be getting in a day. The light physical activity is again based on 24-hour activity guidelines, as is the moderate to vigorous activity in the little green box on the right. And what is striking here, I'll mention, I guess, that here as well, that the darkened blue bars are the participants living with Parkinson's disease. So that's there just for your interest. What is striking here is just how much time is spent sedentary, regardless of the disease cohort throughout the course of the day. And again, this is reflected in the length of the gray bars. And we know that sedentary behavior is independently important to health. So separate from physical activity, we want to make a concentrated effort to reduce the amount of time that we're sedentary. And this impacts our risks for chronic disease differently than engaging in activity. So they do somewhat dissociate. Further, some of the key measures related to Parkinson's disease, for example, are difficult to capture successfully in a clinic visit. So this could be either because they occur infrequently, something like a fall. They might vary over time. So you might be asked to describe your mood, but your mood ebbs and flows. Or they're difficult to replicate in a clinic setting, something like freezing of gait. So the result then is that for a clinician to gain insight into these behaviors, we often have to rely on self-report, and this can be problematic. So monitoring these behaviors at home, so this includes both these lifestyle behaviors and also these clinical features of Parkinson's disease, has the potential to positively impact care in several ways. First, it can provide a more rapid response and action by providing feedback to the patient, to the care provider, or to the clinician. And depending on the time course of that feedback, you could almost imagine in the future, we're not there yet, but in the future, for example, the ability to modify a person's medication regimen in response to real-time data that, for example, the clinician is receiving. So this is sort of a critical element, and there's a lot of potential here in terms of monitoring at home. Also, monitoring at home can reveal triggers to infrequent events and provide insight again into some of these time-varying changes that occur. It can provide a more sensitive method to evaluate treatments, because now we're no longer limited to evaluating them at discrete points in time. So not only every time you visit your clinician, but we could and have the potential to monitor for extended periods of time continuously. And also to improve access and support, for example, to individuals in rural and remote communities, or those who do not have access to specialist care, for example. So here I'm just going to take a moment to feature another study where the investigators were attempting to measure freezing of gait in daily life. So in this study, they used these inertial measurement units, both the combination of that linear motion and the angular motion, to first find periods of walking in daily life, and then within those periods of walking to find freezing of gait. And again, this was data collected at home on 48 participants who wore a total of 3 sensors for 7 days. Among those participants, there was a group that had freezing of gait episodes and a group that didn't often experience freezing of gait. And they applied some algorithms or calculations to the data that they had first validated in the lab. And that is often an important first step. So the results of this study was that their approach could differentiate. So it could identify those people who were people who experienced freezing of gait versus those people who did not experience freezing of gait as a sort of typical symptom of their disease. And this was just a recent study published this year. What this study demonstrates is the ability to detect freezing of gait. And in this way, we have the possibility of being able to intervene. So we could, for example, after having detected a period of freezing of gait, provide some sort of cue to the individual, some sequence of rhythmic stimuli to allow them to begin walking again. So sort of a cued biofeedback type response. But now work by several groups is sort of advancing that even further and striving to predict when these freezing of gait episodes are likely to occur, so that so essentially what they're trying to identify is a pre-freezing of gait phase, so that the potential exists to intercept that freezing of gait episode altogether. So the value of being able to first detect and then advance the field so that we can predict means that we will optimize the intervention. In our own group, we're embarking on a study led by myself and Dr. Kaylina Eggerts-Martin to continue work in this area of freezing of gait by now combining continuous ECG or electrocardiography with the movement data to see if we can identify a pre-freezing of gait phase that is specific to anxiety. So we're now looking at the sort of relationship between non-motor and motor aspects of freezing of gait. And this builds on a body of work that Dr. Eggerts-Martin has conducted to understand that, to understand the relationship between non-motor symptoms, things like mood or affect or stress or anxiety, on freezing of gait. So in summary, wearable technology is grounded in some very common sensor technologies that are embedded in most of the devices. Existing consumer grade devices, no doubt they are remarkable and they have their place, but they are limited to some extent in their ability to meet current needs if they're used alone. So when I say current needs, I mean specifically for clinical application. We have sort of determined that this multi-sensor approach is feasible. We do need to continue to improve that approach. We need to strike this important balance that I spoke to you about earlier. And we do believe that it's often necessary to have more than one sensor to extract meaningful information. We also talked about new opportunities emerging from combining the data from multiple sensors. So this idea that we can not only get more accurate pictures of a symptom or a behavior, but also that we can get a richer picture of health and disease more broadly. Common to all of our measures of interest, whether they be lifestyle or specific clinical features, there is this importance to be able to assess them outside of the clinic and daily life, and we are headed in that direction. Tremendous advances are being made in the capture of Parkinson's disease phenomena, things that we weren't able to capture previously, but we do need to continue to push these boundaries so that we can meet diagnostic and therapeutic needs. And I will leave it there with a thank you and an acknowledgement to my co-lead within the Andre at Home platform, Dr. Bill McElroy, the entire Andre at Home team, all the Andre investigators and staff, and our group at Waterloo, which consists of collaborators and students and staff who are helping to advance these efforts. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Karen. It's Mark from PSSO.
Mark.
Great to talk with you again. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We do have some questions here, and I think before we actually get to the questions, I'm going to ask you, we've heard the term ONDRI, which I know stands for Ontario Neurodegenerative Disease Research Initiative. It's a mouthful.
It is.
But we've heard that multiple times throughout the presentation and in your introduction. And I just want you to take a couple minutes, if you would, and explain what ONDRI is, how many people are involved, because I don't think people realize the scale and what its ultimate goal is.
Yes, absolutely. So ONDRI has been around for, I'm going to approximate about 8 years now. It had an initial sort of 5-year funded period where they conducted sort of what they refer to as their foundational study. In that foundational study, there were about 500 or just over 500 participants representing these 5 disease cohorts of interest. That is the focus of ONDRI. And they engaged in this very rich, what's referred to as sort of a deep endophenotyping exercise. So participants enrolled in that study had a tremendous amount of information gathered about their health and their disease across many different areas of focus. So neuropsychology and genomics and imaging, gait and balance, and on and on. And then when we were renewed, we sort of continued to evolve and have now sort of brought into the mix this remote monitoring piece and other studies that are either have sort of existed as pilot studies and now moving into a larger sort of V2 of ONDRI, which will be conducted primarily remotely. So again, it's this mix of data from blood draws to neuropsychology to wearables, but all of it done remotely. So we are sort of headed in that direction in this next phase of the program. So we are just currently ready to launch that study. We'll probably launch in June or July of this year. And so we're excited about this next phase.
Excellent. And how many researchers, just a ballpark number?
Yeah, so there are a lot. To me, the value and the real sort of uniqueness and impact afforded by ONDRI is that it's bringing together academic scientists, clinician scientists, patients, other people with lived experience, their care partners, and sort of also alongside of our patient and community advisory committee. So this really rich network of people that probably totals over 200. So it's a large initiative with a lot of people focused on many different areas of neurodegenerative disease.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important that people realize how many researchers and care partners and patients are involved in an initiative like this. So we do have a question. It's a bit of a speculative one. I know you love those, but how far away do you think we are from a working wearable Parkinson's disease type biosensor? And then what do you think it'll look like?
That's a great question. So there are some sort of early version Parkinson's disease specific technologies that are emerging. There's one, for example, that a person would wear sort of in a waist belt around their hip. This is out of Europe, and it's intended to monitor the symptoms of Parkinson's disease continuously throughout the course of the day. There's another one that is watch-based. And it is, again, specifically intended to examine kind of the ebb and flow of symptoms throughout the course of the day. They're in early stages to the extent that, you know, they've gotten approval as devices, as medical devices, but the evidence in support of validation and ecological sort of appropriateness are still quite early. It's very promising though. So, and the rate, I will add to that, the rate with which these things are evolving is just, it's exploding, and this rate is sort of growing exponentially. So I am very hopeful, I remain hopeful that we will arrive at a device or a set of devices that can be packaged to specifically target the needs of people living with Parkinson's disease. I'm not going to put a date on it though.
Okay, no dates. No, we won't hold you to a date. The next question comes out, and it's a bit of a different tact. It asks, you know, could biosensors be used as a diagnostic tool when looking at a potential Parkinson's patient?
Yeah, so I think this sort of aligns a little bit with the previous question, meaning can we capture the kind of data that we need to use it diagnostically? And that means having sort of the level of sensitivity to be able to detect these things, to have a body of research that emerges where we can validate the outcomes that are possible from the wearable sensors to, you know, clinically validated markers of the disease. So this term digital biomarker is, you know, it's a buzzword. We're hearing it now with regards to many different things. I think it's what we're all striving for, right? It's this desire to move forward and advance the field to the extent that we would be able to diagnose. But in the absence of being able to diagnose, there's certainly great promise for being able to manage the symptoms that people are experiencing.
We have another question from online. It says, I have a new Apple Watch Series 6. Somebody's lucky. Do you have any tips on using it to optimize my wellness with PD?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. I think in terms of some of these, so the Apple Watch for sure has features and has been sort of validated to an extent that some of those other devices that I sort of flashed on the screen have not. So Apple has done quite a nice job making sure that their technology is providing good quality data. There are limitations that will remain with a single sensor, you know, packaged in a way where we can't sort of understand how those outcomes are being derived. So I think for the user of that device, what becomes important is to just be aware of the patterns and the trends in your data. So over time, those patterns are your normal. And what you can then look for is times when you deviate from normal. And I know that that sounds like an impossibility given the symptoms that people living with Parkinson's disease experience. But even considering, you know, good days and bad days and ebbs and flows, off states and on states, if there's anything that you can sort of glean by capturing these data and tracking these data over time, this may inform your wellness routine in some way. And I would also encourage people to share that information with their clinicians. So this doesn't mean having to wait until you have an appointment with your specialist, but it could be other clinicians in your circle of care that might find that information helpful and which they can use to then, you know, provide you with feedback to inform your wellness plan.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Another question has come up. How can people with Parkinson's disease become involved in your research, possibly as subjects? Does it require a referral? Do you accept them directly? Or do you have a process?
Yep, so that's another great question. In the first round of Andre, there were 16 sort of affiliated sites spread across the province of Ontario, and people were referred into this study from physicians who were sort of connected to those 16 sites. In these early days of the next iteration of Andre, which is now, I'll throw another acronym out there for you, is called HANDS Ontario, which stands for Promoting Health in aging and neurodegenerative disease and dementias. So if you thought Andre was a mouthful, this one's even greater in length. So in early days of HANDS Ontario, it will be referral based, but we are, as part of our ethics process, our ethics review process, trying to integrate other methods and systems by which people can be enrolled into the study. So I would encourage people who have an interest to go to the Andre website. It's andre.ca, and there'll be information about HANDS Ontario on the website, including information about how you might be able to get involved. And so I think that you will see that as HANDS Ontario evolves, there will be opportunities to come in on a non-referral basis. We're just not there quite yet. But the other thing I'll add to that is, given that this is a remote protocol, you really can be anywhere and participate. So when the time comes by which you can enroll directly into the study, you will be able to do everything from wherever you are.
Right. The last question at this point we have is, someone brought up the thought about wearable tech and wearing, or getting tired of wearing it, or getting overwhelmed with wearing it. Do you think that's going to be a problem going forward with the biosensors?
Yeah, it's a great question. These are all such great questions. So some studies have looked at, many people who are sort of working in this space have what we refer to as extended wear protocols, but really 7 days is short by comparison. If we're thinking about people adopting this as sort of a standard of practice. Where you might imagine, I guess, a few models, one being that they'd be asked to wear it for a 7-day period many times over the course of the year, or alternatively, just continue wearing it. So some studies have actually looked at longer periods of time, up to a year, or certainly several months of wear. And what they're finding is that the sort of attrition, or the lack of willingness to continue wearing them, has a lot to do with the amount of engagement required. So this is why I made mention earlier about us wanting to be able to give these sensors to people and hopefully, get them to a point where they're able to forget about them. But this absolutely feeds into what we need to do to optimize the approach, and right down to comfort and aesthetic, and minimizing interference with activities of daily living. We need to make sure we get that right to ensure that people will continue to wear them.
Wonderful. Well, Karen, this has just been great. It's such a topic that's so close to everyone. We're all wearing our Apple Watches, and we're carrying around our phones, and we become a very tech society. So this is a very pertinent subject, I think. And the research that you're developing around Parkinson's and is just so exciting to watch as it progresses. So thank you again for joining us. And I think what we'll be doing is looking for updates from you in the future, and
Absolutely.
seeing where this is going, and periodically getting some information. So I hope you'll
absolutely. Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure, and I always enjoy these forums for sharing research. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you, Karen. We'll now pause for another short break. Our broadcast continues in about 5 minutes as we welcome our final speaker, Dr. Jessica Graun, who's going to be speaking about music and Parkinson's. So please join us, stay with us, and send any questions in as you think of them. Thank you.